Okay, welcome back. The last highlight of the conference is the second keynote by Elke Weber. Elke is born in Germany, in the Ruhr area. She studied at NYU, got a PhD from Harvard, was a professor at Chicago, Ohio State, Columbia University, and in 2016 she moved to Princeton. Well, she's a psychologist in training, but I know her work very well because she works on risk perception and risk preferences. So there's some intersection with behavioral finance and finance. Also, she is one of the founders of cultural finance, I would say, because she always pointed out that culture is very important for risk perception, risk preferences. Now she's working on maybe the most important risk, which is climate risk. Maybe that's the last risk, if you're not careful, the last risk which human mankind can think of. She is a member of the National Academy of Science, a fellow of the American Academy of Art and Science, also the German Leopoldina. She has a guest professorship, from what I understand, from Technical University in Munich, and an honorary doctorate from Switzerland. Unfortunately not from Zurich, but from Basel. Okay, so the floor is yours. I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Torsten, and let me share my screen. Okay, here we go.
So the full screen was quicker than before.
Okay.
Good start. Good start.
Excellent. So I do want to talk about some psychological processes that allow us to address status quo bias. And thank you, Torsten, for your very kind introduction. And it's also reassuring that sort of if you live long enough, sort of you found areas that nobody ever knew existed, like cultural finance. So that's very nice to know that this has now become like a full-fledged and legitimate area of investigation. So I think that's a very good development. So as you mentioned, a lot of my research in terms of applications in the last 20 or 30 years has been on climate change. And as you probably all know very well, for better or worse, we live in a time period that has been coined the Anthropocene to describe the fact that our behavior, human behavior, and in particular with respect to energy and energy consumption, the sources of energy, the amount we consume, is now influencing and changing the environment. And the ruling assumption in that domain is that the kinds of decisions that we make about energy are rational. It's homo economicus that's making the decisions, both as a consumer, as a policymaker. And if there's not enough action, that means that there's not enough information. There's an information deficit, and we have to generate more science. That is certainly an enterprise that scientists are engaged in. But what I want to argue is that's not sufficient, because we really are dealing with the wrong species. The kinds of decisions that are made by Homo sapiens. And Homo sapiens is not primarily a creature of rational deliberation. Of course, we have sort of Homo economicus and his or her decision processes and abilities as part of our repertoire, and that's an amazing evolutionary accomplishment. But we also have other sort of decision processes, other goals in place, of which Homo economicus is only a subset. In a subset, it doesn't necessarily come automatic, but has to be acquired. We might have the hardware, the wetware, for rational deliberation, but we have to learn the algorithms. We have to sort of program the software to send our kids to college. Now, what do we do best in automatically? Well, we learn very well from personal experience. Pain, suffering is a great teacher. And we use, in general, associations, of which emotions are an important subset, to make decisions, and also rules to guide our actions, in addition to sort of computational processes. Also, we have a large number of goals, of which sort of personal utility maximization is only a subset. We have other regarding preferences. We have psychological goals, like the desire for control. And of this large set of goals that we have, the ones that drive actions are the ones that are at any given point in time active. Yeah? And so activation of goals and of a subset of goals, and to some extent, is a mechanism to change behavior. So in the climate arena and in many other contexts, we need change, we need behavior change. And yeah, breakthroughs are important to overcome the widespread status quo bias we see everywhere. And of course, yeah, we have to price greenhouse gas pollution externalities, but that's not sufficient. You know, there's no silver bullet. There's not just a lot of silver buckshot action on all different fronts. And what I want to argue in this presentation is that the other thing we have to change is to stop assuming that all behavior is rational. And if we better understand, predict, and guide actual perceptions and actual behavior at all levels, not just at the consumer level, but also at the corporate level, at the level of policymakers, we have some chance of overcoming our fear of change and the pervasive status quo bias. So how do we do that? So what I want to tell you about are three mechanisms that I've looked at personally, and lots of other colleagues, designed to help us as Homo sapiens to give the future a chance, to be more focused on future consequences, rather than on the here and now, which is sort of a not unwise allocation of scarce attentional and processing capacity. We are boundedly rational. But what I want to argue is in many situations, including climate change, but also situations closer to home, healthy eating, wise saving for our retirement, it's important to also allocate a good portion of our attentional capacity to the future. And we don't seem to do that automatically and naturally. So we have to sort of help ourselves along. How do we do that? And I will talk about one cognitive intervention and about two motivational interventions. And so the cognitive intervention I will start with is query theory. And query theory is a framework, a theoretical framework that Eric Johnson and I have been developing over the last 10, 15 years. It encompasses and describes judgments and decisions in a broad set of circumstances: risky choice, intertemporal choice, multi-attribute decisions. And the general notion is that we tend to think about making a decision, making a judgment as a weighing of arguments that come from our past experience with these actions, with these kinds of judgments. And whatever option or whatever judgment sort of has the largest balance of evidence, that's the one we go with. So it's a process of arguing with ourselves. But because we are boundedly rational, when we issue queries, and hence the label query theory, when we issue queries to our knowledge base that says, okay, what argues for option B, or what argues for option A, we cannot think about both options at the same time. Just like in this reversible figures, you can look at the white candlestick in the middle. You can also see the two children looking at each other. You can switch back and forth between these two percepts, but you really can't see them both at the same time. And that's the idea also about query theory. We basically sort of switch back and forth between sort of and I should say this happens typically automatically and unconsciously. But I'm going to sort of make these processes somewhat more accessible in a second. But we basically sort of query our knowledge base about what argues for option A or option B. We do it sequentially. And here's the important part. It matters in the order in which we sort of issue those two queries matters. Whatever option we consider first generates a larger body of arguments for it, all other things being equal, because when we first think about what's good about option A, we temporarily inhibit all arguments for all response competitors, for all other options on the table. But then as we, a split second later, turn to what's good about option B, those arguments have a somewhat harder time coming to the surface because they were just inhibited. So all other things being equal, the first query generates a larger body of evidence. So that's, of course, that's the theory. So let's see to what extent the theory actually explains observed behavior. And then we sort of turn to intertemporal choice, which of course is very important in environmental decisions. A lot of intertemporal decisions, a lot of environmental decisions that we make are investments into the future. We're sort of allocating some of our current economic capacity, some of our current comfort to generating behaviors or technologies that in the long run will sort of pay us back in terms of lower greenhouse gas emissions, or sometimes also sort of lower heating costs. And so the question is, yes, how patient or impatient are we in our intertemporal decisions? And since 1988, due to George Lowenstein, we know that it matters how an intertemporal choice is being framed. If we are assuming that we are getting the sooner, smaller option now, in this case, $58.30 today, an Amazon gift certificate, but we can change to a larger amount later, from the sooner, smaller to the larger later option. People tend to be quite impatient. They tend to sort of pick the option on the left. But if we assign the default to the larger later option, in other words, we tell people you're assigned to get the $70.90 in 2 weeks' time. But if you want to, you can change to the sooner, smaller option right now. They tend to be much more patient. And so what I want to argue is that one important question to the million-dollar question that comes out of query theory, which is which option gets considered first, is that default options are considered first. So it matters whether or not you're assigned to get the larger later amount first, or whether you're assigned to get the sooner smaller amount first, and you can change to the other behavior. So if that's the case, if query processes are influenced, the order of queries is influenced by which option is the default, we should be able, first of all, to sort of show this in the context of intertemporal choice and delay versus acceleration framing, and document that, in fact, arguments for one option or the other are not randomly generated, randomly dispersed, but that they come clustered, and that the order of the clusters is predicted, for example, in this case, by which option is the default option. Default options get considered first, and which option gets considered first generates a larger number of arguments because it hasn't been inhibited yet. And that in conjunction, those two process measures, initial attention, and therefore a larger basis of evidence for that option, mediate any differences in choice. So that's the general idea. And so I'm showing you study one from a series of studies we did back in 2007. And first of all, we replicate the Lowenstein 1988 result. What I'm plotting here is a discount factor. In other words, how much is $1 in a year's time worth to you today? And as you can see in the delay condition, $1 in a year's time is worth to you 34 cents today. So quite impatient. And less impatient so in the people in the acceleration condition who were assigned to get the larger later amount, but could switch to the sooner smaller. Much less impatient, $1 in a year's time only goes down to 57 cents today. So significant difference in choice and in impatience. Is this mediated by query theory processes? The next slide on the right shows you, yes, indeed, the proportion of impatient aspects, in other words, arguments for choosing the sooner, smaller option is 39% in the delay condition, but only 28% in the acceleration condition, so it's smaller. And that is actually associated with the fact that the arguments that people provide for choosing one option or the other are not randomly interspersed, but are clustered, and that arguments for the sooner, smaller option come first in the delay condition, and are second in the acceleration condition. So how do we know this? Well, we do these experiments online. And so people are given the choice that I just showed you earlier, intertemporal choice in this case. And we tell them, before you make this decision, why don't you type out loud what is going through your mind as you make this decision? We pre-train them to do this one thought at a time. And then afterwards, we can code these arguments of whether they're arguments for the sooner, smaller, for the larger, later option, for neither, for both. And then look at the list of arguments that they generate, presumably a random subset of all the arguments that are automatically sort of coming in from their knowledge base to see whether or not that mediates the differences in choice. And in this case, actually, it does. Yeah? So the difference in choice for the sooner, smaller option in the delay versus acceleration condition is mediated by these processes. Now, completely correlational still. And so the proof is in the pudding. So if these correlational processes, in fact, are causally involved, then we should be able to intervene in the sort of natural argument query order processes by telling people explicitly now in study 2, some people under the delay condition, some people under acceleration condition, but half of the people in the delay condition are told now explicitly, rather than type what goes through your mind, they're being told, first tell us what's good about the immediate option, and then tell us what's good about the delayed option. And of course, in the opposite direction, the acceleration condition. We call this natural order because this is what people did without prompting in the first study. Or now we can do this for the other half of the people in the delay condition in the unnatural order. And so if it is indeed the order in which queries get issued, we would find that the differences in intertemporal choice between those two conditions should go away. In fact, first of all, let me show that in the natural condition, the difference in choice, much more impatience for the delay condition, the yellow bars, than for the acceleration condition, the blue bars. It's intensified because now they're doing it clustered, completely clustered, yeah, and we replicate the previous result. In the unnatural order, the difference becomes statistically not significant. It didn't switch, as you might have expected. Maybe the order of preferences should have switched. And I think the reason it doesn't switch is because consciously people are doing it in the unnatural order, but unconsciously and automatically, the default being such a strong prompt to look at this option first, they're doing it in the other way, and the two forces cancel each other out. Okay, so now we have a mechanism about sort of how to make the future more prominent, which is to make it the default option. Does this work for environmental decisions? And the short answer is yes. There's now a lot of evidence, looking at both experimental studies and field experiments, randomized controlled trials in lots of environmental contexts, summarized in a recent paper by Sunstein and Reich, that in lots of applications, whether it's lighting technology or green versus brown electric power provision by utility companies, providing people with the environmentally more forward-looking option as a default from which they can switch away if they desire is very powerful. And so generates not just an immediate, more environmentally conscious behavior, but also behavior that sort of stays that way over the long run. I don't have time to tell you about this, but it even works for professional decision makers. We did this by changing the software, the rating software used by infrastructure engineers and architects, and it made a significant difference there in the sustainability of their designs. One thing I want to sort of mention is this really, really interesting paper that I had the chance to read recently by Rigo, Wang, and Hens on cultural differences in time preference, sort of strong systematic differences between different regions of the world on how they're making the temporal decisions. And what that suggests that there might be cultural differences in how chronically, frequently the future is in fact the foreground, is being considered first in these different cultures, which might sort of have some interesting sort of ways of maybe measuring those cultural differences by looking at media displays or maybe text analysis. So let's get back to status quo bias. And we basically talked about the fact that we know how it does come about. Of course, prospect theory already explains the results that I showed you before in intertemporal choice and in other contexts by basically sort of assuming loss aversion. Losses loom large, losses hurt twice as much as gains make us feel good, is not a good recipe for change, right? Because that means that you're only going to change to a new alternative if it's twice as good as the old one, because you don't like giving up what you're losing in the old one to get what you're getting in the new context. And query theory, I should point out, is not an alternative to prospect theory. It's like a lower level psychological process explanation for why the functional regularities described by prospect theory actually come apart, for why we get loss aversion, for why and how we get loss aversion and the endowment effect and other factors. And so we shouldn't be surprised by the fact that people object to change. But we should expect that people will object to change. But maybe the same processes that we described about giving rise to the status quo bias can also tell us something about what will happen when the status quo gets changed against people's better wishes. And maybe by an act of God, I'm going to show you one in a second, but of course now we have COVID as another act of God that's changing lots of our behaviors. And sometimes by brave politicians, which do exist occasionally. And so let's think about that for a second. If the status quo, the default option currently in place, gets examined first in the case of query theory, and therefore gets the query theory bump, if you want, the increase in arguments because its arguments get considered first. That of course gives rise to the status quo bias. But if the status quo gets changed, the previously hated new alternative does become the law of the land, does become the new default that in fact is in place. And the question is, how long does it take before people sort of psychologically adjust to that and then consider arguments for it first? And now the new option getting the query theory bump. On top of that, if the change in fact was welfare improving, people presumably will experience those welfare improvements, and get additional evidence. So the question is, how long would it happen? How long would it take before the previously hated status quo actually gets embraced by people? So let me first of all show you another act of God. You recognize this as San Francisco. The old San Francisco with the Embarcadero Freeway, which was built in the 1960s. And soon after it was built, people realized it was an eyesore. It was cutting the city off from the shoreline. And yet there was so much opposition against getting rid of it. The traffic engineers were predicting traffic snares. The merchants in Chinatown, where the Embarcadero Freeway ended, sort of were fearing they would lose customers. So it couldn't be changed. But the 1989 earthquake took care of it. And within hours, the city council decided not to rebuild. So basically taking it out removes the question. There was sort of no question of rebuilding it. And also no question economically and aesthetically that the new Embarcadero without the freeway is a huge improvement. So what happens when a politician basically sort of says, well, I'm not going to rule by public opinion polls. I'm going to shape public opinion. I'm going to do what is in the best public welfare. And we did some text analysis on two such actions. One of them was an announcement in 2002 by, at the time, Mayor Bloomberg in New York City to impose a citywide smoking ban that included restaurants and bars. There was a huge outcry against that. The industry was afraid nobody was going to come and drink if they couldn't smoke at the same time. And in 2008, British Columbia announced one of the first carbon taxes. It was wisely announced. It was revenue neutral and was returned on a per capita basis to citizens every 6 months. And yet there was a huge outcry against it. Sort of local business was afraid, that we're going to sort of become non-competitive because of that. And people didn't want to be told what they could or couldn't do. And so not surprisingly, when you look at a media analysis of both of these announcements, by looking at a sentiment analysis in 3 newspapers that mentions this initiative in any way, public sentiment goes south at announcement, becomes negative. It bottoms out at implementation. And then the question is, how long does it take? Does it become positive? How long does it take to become net positive again? In the case of the smoking ban, you see that within, I think, 9 months, or actually within 15 months, it becomes net positive. The Mayor Bloomberg did get reelected, not once, but twice after that. And now the smoking ban is sort of the poster child for enlightened public health policy. And similarly, in British Columbia, at announcement, public sentiment goes south, it bottoms out at implementation. In this case, it took 9 months to become net positive again. The ban is still the tax is still in place, and the premier again sort of got reelected, I think at least twice after that. So let me stop with the first cognitive intervention and now switch to the 2 motivational interventions I want to tell you about. One of them is the priming of legacy motives, and the other one is to basically utilize our view of the past as a mirror towards the future. So let's start with the legacy motivation. There's a lot of evidence in social psychology that reminding people of their deaths and of the fact that they can somehow sort of lessen the terror of thinking about their deaths by thinking about sort of what they might leave behind, what lasting legacies they might leave behind in terms of buildings donated to universities, yeah, or educational initiatives that you start, papers that you write, that reminding people of their legacy motivation favors pro-social and intergenerational action. And so we thought we would investigate to what extent we can apply that now to also climate change action. There are 2 studies, again, online research in this paper. We basically ask people, the first study is correlational evidence, the second study provides causal evidence, you know, a similar pattern in also my first and third example. And in the first study, basically we measured people's legacy motivations, yeah, with a 3-item metric. It's important to me, leave a positive legacy, care about what future generations think of me. Many people vary on how much legacy motivations they have, maybe sort of naturally or unpromptedly. So when you do that, so you have you know, our legacy motive index. We also have a belief in climate change index and behavioral intentions for pro-environmental behavior. And on top of that, an actual donation to an environmental charity. And so this is, in this case, it was Trees for the Future. And out of a bonus that they could earn of $10, you know, they were told they can donate some of that money towards this environmental charity. And you know, we incentivized that by telling them that and not just telling them, but doing so, that any amount they donated would be doubled by us. You know, and so there was some incentive to be generous. And the question was, how much would they donate, you know, to this charity, and how much to keep for themselves as a function of their legacy motivation. So when you look at the results, at the bottom we have basically a z-score of the sample in terms of their stated legacy motivations from very little to a lot, 2 standard deviations above the mean. And as you can see, both for their behavioral intentions, how much they intend to engage in pro-environmental decisions, their beliefs in climate change, and their actual donations to this environmental charity, there were significant increases on all 3 dependent measures. Just to give you an idea about the donations, you know, people in the bottom quartile on average gave $1.75 out of the $10, 22% donated, and that was almost doubled, you know, in the top quartile, the $3.41 with 31% donated. So again, study 2 now is basically trying to manipulate the accessibility of legacy motives. You know, there might be chronic differences or differences in the chronic level in which we have these legacy motives, but we all have them to some extent. And to get back to one of my earlier points, it's motivations, it's goals that are active at the time of decision that drive our decisions. So can we activate these legacy motives? And we did this by giving half of the respondents in the second study an essay to write. Yeah, so they're writing about what they want future generations to remember them for, the positive impact on other people's skills or knowledge he will teach others, and so on. And so people wrote this essay or not. Okay? Half of them did, half of them did not. And so relative to these controls who didn't write the essay, we find that behavioral intentions significantly increased, and again, donations to this NGO significantly increased. And as a manipulation check, indeed, legacy motives for those people who wrote the essay were significantly higher than the legacy motives assessed right after this decision in the control group. And I know mediation analysis has sort of become somewhat criticized recently, but I think it still shows to some extent causal pathways and plausible causal pathways. And then just to show you, the essay prime did significantly increase people's belief in climate change. But if you also include legacy motives in this regression, the regression coefficient becomes non-significant. So there's a significant mediation of beliefs in climate change, and also I think donations of climate change, you know, sort of through the priming of legacy motives. Okay, so now let me turn to the last study and the last mechanisms of how to remind people of the fact that the future is something worth investing in. And this might very well be my favorite, so it's hard to have favorites among one's own papers. But yeah, think about the fact that environmental action is basically a trade-off between sort of current costs for future benefits. It's an investment into the future. And you know, you're more likely to invest in the future if you think that the future is something worth investing in. And so that means that sort of you want the future, you're going to invest more in the future if you think it's going to be longer. So there's longer in duration, or if it's going to be better, you know, sort of better in terms of, you know, sort of the people that you care about, you know, and the things that might happen. Now, Churchill told us, you know, something about the past being a mirror to the future. The longer you can look back, the further you can look forward. But yeah, what triggered our attention was an astrophysicist called Gott. It's a perfect name for an astrophysicist. At University of Pennsylvania. And so he basically came to Berlin in the, I think, mid-70s, and was sort of struck by the fact that there was this wall, the Berlin Wall. And he wondered sort of how long will the Berlin Wall continue to exist? And then he said, well, let me stop right here. I'm a scientist. I can answer that question by first principles. Think about the fact that everything has a starting point and an end point. Yeah, we know the starting point, we don't know what the end point is, but think about sort of where you now as an observer are getting dropped into that continuum from start to end. And all other things being equal by the principle of insufficient reasoning, the most likely place where you're going to be dropped is going to be in the middle. So the average place you're going to be dropped in the middle. So that means that whatever exists will continue to exist just as long as it has existed already. So again, the future being a mirror to the past. And in terms of duration in this case. And by similar arguments, you can also put confidence limits, you know, around sort of your best estimate. So he did this and actually then also started a sideline where he was predicting all sorts of other things like the duration of movies, you know, in movie houses and so on. But yes, when the Berlin Wall came down in 1998, I think, he would basically the total duration was well within what you had predicted by his model. So we thought, well, maybe we can put this insight to work by asking people, sort of by getting people to think about the future as something that is sort of longer or more glorious, as a way of getting them to sort of invest into the future, because the future will be just as long as glorious as the past, as they perceive the past to be. And here we have a study that actually looks a lot like the study I mentioned earlier, the universal time preference. We looked at, now in this case, at environmental performance index, people's countries' environmental performance. Yale has a very nice index that looks at 10 different categories of environmental health and ecosystems vitality. And as so this is our dependent measure. And as our predictor, we use the country age. And of course, you know, sort of it's naive to assume that just how the length of time a country has been in existence would predict how much, you know, they invest into their environmental conditions, how much they will invest in environmental action. Obviously, GDP and also, you know, sort of political systems play a role. And so we included, of course, GDP and the Worldwide Governance Index as covariates. But you know, when you sort of plot the results, country age against environmental performance, either with or without outliers, there's a strong significant relationship. Well, again, this is correlational evidence. Yeah, so what about causal evidence? And of course, causal evidence is hard to provide at country levels. Yeah, we can try to do this at the individual level. And so here now we have an online study where people in the US were shown sort of 2 timelines for how long the US has been in existence. So in the new US condition, we basically arbitrarily started our timeline at the beginning of the Roman Empire. When you do that, there's not a lot of time left sort of after the US got founded as a country, as a political entity, and not much space to still show them what a glorious country this actually is. But in the old US condition, the other half of respondents, you know, so we, again, completely arbitrarily started our timeline with Christopher Columbus sailing from Spain. And then within that time period, the US has a long range, and so it looks like an old country with lots of opportunities to show people what an amazing country this is. And so this doesn't make it, and then we asked them a whole bunch of other questions, and eventually asked them again for their willingness to invest in an environmental NGO, actual donations. And in this case, I think it was out of $25 that they could earn. And then the other moderator we looked at is how close people felt to future generations. So think about, again, investing into the future as a function about whether you think the future is long and glorious or the future is short and maybe not quite as glorious. That only is going to make a difference if you actually care for others in the future. If you don't care about others, you know, sort of it shouldn't make a difference which condition you're in. But if indeed you do care for others in the future, then sort of making the future seem longer and more important sort of should make a difference. So what was the effect of long versus short US conditional donation? Out of the $25, people in the old US condition gave significantly more. And interestingly, there was this interaction we predicted between old versus new US condition in closeness to future generations. Closeness is plotted down here. And basically, sort of, if you are in the young US condition, in other words, it's a young country, therefore probably not much of a future. It didn't matter how close you felt to future generations. But when you were in the old condition where you did think, you know, that there was a longer and more glorious future ahead of you, the closeness to future generations significantly sort of increased, you know, how much you donated to this environmental NGO from $5 to almost $18. So let me start to conclude. I think the future can be made more salient by multiple mechanisms. And so the cognitive mechanism we looked at, you know, sort of was query theory, and, you know, making the future options as a default explicitly, either in some sort of choice architecture context or by some other sort of mechanisms, you know, that highlight, you know, the future environmentally advantageous option as foreground. We also saw two motivational interventions, you know, legacy goals being activated, you know, or reminding or emphasizing the fact that there's a future that's long and successful ahead by emphasizing the mirror image of a long and successful past. When you put these different interventions together in natural contexts, cognition and motivation are always in place. In the lab, we tend to study them in isolation. So I think sort of one of the future types of studies that need to be done much more is to find out what are the best ensembles of these kind of interventions, in the sense that the cognitive or different motivational interventions enhance each other, lead to positive synergies, you know, rather than work against at cross purposes and cancel each other out. So to bring this back to the image that we looked at the beginning of my talk, to really understand, you know, the relationship between human behavior with respect to energy and its influence on climate and the environment. It's a much safer and much more realistic assumption to assume bounded rationality, to assume that we're dealing with Homo sapiens. This will lead to better forecasts about what happens as a result of certain sort of conventional policy interventions. And maybe also will get us to generate more action in the space, you know, both in terms of personal behavior, but also in terms of political action. So let me just acknowledge my funders in some of this work and my many co-authors, you know, but in particular, people that sort of worked with me at Columbia for many years, David Krantz at CRED and Eric Johnson at the CDS. And thank you for your finite attention, which I very much appreciate.
Yeah, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.